Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the preseason cheat sheet. This video is going to be a cheat sheet, really, which is the beta version of the cheat sheet before we have launch. I'm very excited about dropping this cheat sheet because there's a lot of changes. I know I missed out a lot of players from previous cheat sheets, and I really thank you guys for all your thoughts and support in terms of suggestions, in terms of ideas, in terms of what you've learned from some of the defensive data. I've tried to improve the cheat sheet as much as possible, and I've consolidated on a cheat sheet now. We still have a couple key matches to go, right? Like nice Super Cup matches, some teams that haven't been involved in preseason, like City, like Brighton, who've only played one game, and to get a little bit more insight over these teams. And that's pretty much it. The projections are very much supported by Fantasy Football Hub, so you can have a look at the link in the description below, specifically to actually get your team rated, right? The DEFCON features are now actually a part of the AI team rating model, and you can have a look at what your latest draft is going to look like. I'm sure it's going to have a lot of DEFCON players, at least in defense, and you can kind of get almost the updated thoughts on where your team is at right now in the link in the description below. So if we jump into the cheat sheet, as I was saying, there's a lot of new players here. So I wanted to start with the classic position that we always start the cheat sheet with, which is midfield, right? Midfield has been reinvigorated, I think, by the Madison ACL injury. So in the 5 million position, we have Pape Sarr. Do I think he's a great pick? No, I don't really think so, because I tend to think that Spurs aren't going to play in a way where Pape Sarr is suddenly an extremely offensive player. And we know that there is a correlation between the more attacking, generally speaking, or more advanced you are on the pitch, the harder it is to get DEFCON points, right? Unless you're naturally someone like maybe like a Paqueta, or maybe even, let's say, a Bruno, you're a little bit of an abnormal player, right? If you are on that sort of edge of being able to be quite good at the defensive contributions, but then also contributing a lot in terms of open play numbers and volume. So Granit Xhaka is quite nice, and Enzo Lefebvre is quite nice, because I think that's kind of the penalty share of Sunderland. Speaking to Spencer, who's the Planet FPL correspondent of Sunderland, that's kind of where his thoughts lie, and I think I'd like to back that and support that as well. With Granit Xhaka, I don't think his sort of Seabrit level data is really good enough, so I'm not going to say he's an amazing pick. I think Enzo Lefebvre might actually end up being a better pick, but I feel more confident about him being on penalties. I also think that his minutes might be a little bit better, just because when you look at Lefebvre's sort of historical minutes, they're not exactly high up there. So when you kind of taper off the Seabrit per 90 and sort of adjust it for minutes, I think he becomes a little bit worse. And Sarr, I've sort of iterated my thoughts. I also think that Tottenham to start the season don't actually have the greatest of games. It feels a little bit nicer if you own, let's say, a Tottenham defender, which is why they're featured in a lot of people's drafts, because of the rotation aspect of things. Whereas I think in this case, if you're sort of looking for an out-and-out attacker, I wouldn't say it's the most standout run possible. So that's kind of my thoughts right there. As far as the 5.5 position, I think this is where you start to have value. I think Anderson is the best pick. Yes, it seems like Nottingham Forest are investing into another player, but I think that that's not really going to impact Anderson's minutes too much. When I looked at his match logs last season, it kind of reconfirmed my thoughts. He's been starting every single Nottingham Forest match in the Premier League since game week 14 of last season. Can't see his minutes really dropping. Is he like an 85-minute player? I think so. And that's kind of where the value lies when you're a DEFCON player. And once again, I have to iterate that he was standout in this specific aspect of the game. And a lot of people are underrating exactly how good he is in DEFCON. There's a huge gap between someone who averages like 15 or 14 or 13, and you can see a huge drop off with everyone else in this list. With Reinders, I've actually given him a boost. I actually think his minutes are quite strong to start the season. He could actually end up being nailed. Is he going to be a 90-minute player necessarily for every single match? I don't have the confidence to say so. So I'm still kind of at a position where I'm not fully consolidated on Reinders being perfect. Malin has been a new addition to the cheat sheet. Do I think he's an amazing pick? No, because Ghassan coming in is going to hurt him. It's going to hurt all the attackers, really, outside of Rodgers, who we know is pretty much permanently nailed. You have McGinn, Ramsey, you have more Malin, and let's say Ghassan on the right position. Ghassan can also play sort of attacking mid, so Rodgers is also playing there. Tielemans as well sometimes can deputize there, and we can see Rodgers on sort of wing positions, but all of these players, or at least half of them, can actually sort of deputize that center forward as well. So Malin and Ghassan, I think, are the players who are most likely going to be able to take potential center forward minutes going forward if Watkins is going to be subbed off at any point in the game. But do I have really that much confidence in Malin? No, because once the Ghassan news came in, I saw his season-long goal projections drop, which sort of lined up with my thoughts on his minutes being reduced overall if you think about planning the season, and then also what can happen if he doesn't start the season hot. Now, he's had an excellent preseason so far, but there's also players like Buendia and also Leon Bailey that I haven't even mentioned so far that have been, playing a periphery type role within the preseason and could still be involved within the pecking order. So that kind of hurts Malin overall. But otherwise, like if you had real confidence about his minutes, the NPXG, these sorts of numbers are there, and that makes him exciting. Adingra, I'm really not that confident on. I have to be honest, I'm very pessimistic on Sunderland. And that's unfortunately just a team strength thing. It's not really to do with how good the fixtures are. I almost rate kind of team goals first, and then unless you're, let's say, a game breaker, right? There are players obviously you can play for much worse teams that actually have really, good numbers that can hold up and stand alone. But I just don't think Adingra is really at that sort of level. So there he is. Like Caicedo, I've also dropped. Part of this is because I think he's kind of like the real floor pick. And if you're going to pick a floor pick, you might as well go for a 5 million player. I could be wrong on that because, yes, Caicedo is better than a Granit Xhaka, better than an Enzo Lefebvre in terms of recoveries and, of course, expected clean sheet points. But is that really how you want to go about it? I'd probably not, right? At least when you can look at Elliot Anderson, he's got a little bit more attacking sort of return potential. He's got set pieces at least, which can kind of help with the bonus sort of accumulation of things, and is a little bit better at Seabrit. So I just can't see the reason to go for Caicedo, but he is going to guarantee you plus 2 points, maybe 50-60% of the time, and that could be enough to sway you. In the 6 million tier, I actually think we have some genuine value. I think Paqueta's wonderful. There was a point in parts of Potter's stint where last season you couldn't see his minutes being too good, but that there were also sort of runs of games where he was playing 90 minutes straight. I kind of think that he's almost got a fresh start, a new lease on life, if you will. I don't see him being connected with a transfer out like he was maybe a year or two ago, right before the sort of the betting rumors had occurred and also the investigation was undergoing. It seems like he's going to have a pretty productive season. I think the preseason wise, he's had 2 starts now with sort of what would be the starting team, and I kind of think that his minutes will be quite strong to start the season. And being a penalty taker of the team, being someone who's also really, really good at DEFCON and also has okay open play numbers, I actually think he's really good value at 6 million. Tielemans for me is about pen share. The assistive numbers are there, right? He's a creative player and he's quite good at DEFCON, and Villa have a really good run of games. I'd expect Tielemans to also have a small positional share of the 10, but do I think he's that amazing of a pick if he's not on penalties? No, but I think there's enough share there. I think there's enough good quality fixtures there where it's not going to hurt you to start the season with Tielemans. He's almost a pick that can't go wrong because he's got some really nice sort of baselines to him, and then he can kind of overshoot that expectation if he is on somehow penalties, which is possible, right? Because the last time Emery spoke on penalties, he said that it could either be Tielemans or Watkins or McGinn, but maybe, of course, he's already picked who that player is going to be. We don't know yet. Damsgaard, I think, is a great pick as well, so I've given him a little bit of a boost. I've given Jorginho an addition towards the cheat sheet and given Minte a rise. I think Brighton are actually one of the teams that I expect to do really well this season, and so when I kind of evaluate a team like Brighton, I almost think about them as a slightly cheaper version of Bournemouth, a team that really should be a good attack at most times, that actually have minutes that I think are quite secured for certain players. Because when you look at this Brighton team, they really only lost João Pedro. I don't think Welbeck's going to play a full season in terms of minutes, and so when you think about how players like Jorginho, Minte, and Mitoma play the rest of the season, alongside even some of the depth options like Gruda, with Adingra having gone, it's quite foreseeable that this team will do well. So I really do like Jorginho because he's most likely going to play in central type positions. We've obviously seen him play on the right, as I've mentioned previously, but I think the minutes this season will be good, and I have a lot of confidence in him. Let's kind of see what happens in preseason, because the first friendly was quite helpful. I think if you're someone who's interested in a Jorginho, in a Minte, in a Mitoma, I'd like to see whether, Welbeck sort of reintegrates with the squad, plays with the first string team in a different friendly, but that's a good little start for Jorginho. There's obviously other players within the team, like maybe an O'Reilly, who can even, let's say, take up minutes within the 10 spot, but that would, for me, push up Jorginho to a striker position potentially, and actually take the minutes of Welbeck at times. We also know that they've signed some other players as well to sort of be attackers, and it's a bit of a wait and see for me, but I think that you can have faith enough to tempt yourself with, let's say, a differential option from this Brighton team that should have good minutes for these players, because these are the key players that they signed last season. These are the key players that played really good minutes anyways. Jorginho actually had a bit of a setback last season because of an injury, as opposed to his minutes were poor. Minte, I think, had a little bit more time allowed to sort of fight for his sort of position within the team, but generally speaking was the starting right winger. With McNeil, I've actually given him a little bit of a drop. I think, yes, he overperformed a lot last season. Most of his value, once again, comes from creation, which will also be attributed to his sort of set piece quality. Everton are signing some more players. I don't think they're necessarily signing a right winger at this moment in time, so maybe that's a boost to McNeil, but I probably just don't really like his value, and I think the DEFCON just doesn't exist for him whatsoever. So I'm not really sure if McNeil's a pick that I absolutely love right now. He's probably my least favorite 6 million. That is still viable. In the 6.5 million tier, I've given Njai a rise. I've given Mitoma a rise. I hope that's how you pronounce Njai, because I've received a couple comments on it, and I hope this is the one. Njai is wonderful for DEFCON. Mitoma has really good open play numbers, and I think really good minutes to back that up outside of, as I said, the injury based on the previous cheat sheet. Sar is a wonderful pick, but I just think the fixtures are a little bit too poor for Crystal Palace, and I tend to think that most people's drafts will benefit from a little bit less rotation this season, given what the game has sort of given us in terms of strengthening our weaker players, like let's say, what a 4.0 defender is expected to get. So this is kind of a new underpinning concept where I do think fixture runs matter a little bit more, because in the past, I think if you had a player who was objectively good, like let's say Sar, Ismaila Sarr that is, we would probably look for rotation, right? Maybe an 8 attacking lineup to actually allow for him. But a lot of people are spending, only on 7 attackers, or even arguably like, let's say 6 attackers, right? I've seen some 4-5-1 lineups, as much as people might, be pained to hear that. And I think the reality is because these DEFCON points sort of reduce the need for rotation a little bit. Your 4.0 defender also is much stronger than they previously ever were. They're better than the 4.5 midfielders of the past. They're better than the 4.5 forwards, maybe outside of, whatever Gu can do this season if he can do something. But generally that expectation has sort of risen, and you don't need to almost look for rotation patterns as much within the attacking players. So I tend to think prioritizing good fixture runs with good players with good minutes is probably going to be the way to play the season. And unfortunately, Sar sort of disbenefits from that. Kudus, I kind of think there's still a lot of growing pains with the Spurs team, and I'm not sure if I would say his minutes are absolutely guaranteed, despite the key and obvious injuries within the squad. So yeah, I'm not super confident in him, and I don't think there's any intangibles with him either when you compare it to some of these other players here who are really good at minutes. Enzo I've kind of classed as a yellow player because I do think he'll rotate a bit more. I do think Chelsea will rotate a bit more naturally this season, even though he's a key player and clearly a part of the starting 11. In the 7 million tier, I've actually given Semenyo a rise because I've actually looked into the data. The DEFCON data for him was really impressive last season. I think I have to give credit towards that and kind of how that artificially sort of inflates his game-to-game averages. So I've put Semenyo there. I feel confident putting Semenyo there. And the idea really is if you can bench someone like Semenyo in game week 1, or even if you can kind of suck it up, right? And just deal with it. He's a really good pick going forwards, and that's undeniable because Bournemouth are a really strong attack. Neto, I feel like, is going to have slightly reduced minutes this season, and I also think he's a little bit overpriced considering he's also not good at DEFCON whatsoever. So there's no additional value there. So when you compare it to, let's say, another player who isn't good at DEFCON at all, but actually has really good fixtures like Rodgers, I just think that Rodgers is better because the minutes are better too. And yeah, underlying stats for Rodgers were even better than Neto's last season. Shade is, I think, injured, so I've kind of put an asterisk around him. I'm not really sure whether he's going to be available to start the season. Either way, I think the Brentford game, the Brentford run isn't that spectacular. I do expect Shade to actually have a really good season. I think he's arguably a little bit overpriced if you think that this Brentford team's taken a huge step back, and they probably have in terms of quality, but he's close and he's there and thereabouts. But is the fixture run that spectacular for you to start the season with Shade? I'd probably say no. Would he have pen share? I also think no. So I think Igor Thiago is most likely going to get pen share, even if Wisa's like leaving the club. So that's kind of why I think Shade for now is a bit of a differential. Kluivert is someone that I'd probably miss out on. I don't really know why he's missed all of Bournemouth's friendly so far. I don't really even know what the situation is. I'm one of the players who unfortunately painfully carried Kluivert over, I think, a wildcard 30 or 31 last season for many, many games where he was, having a short-term injury that ended up being a long-term injury. And I don't know whether there are repercussions of that. We also saw at the start of the sort of transfer window that he was mentioned to have, let's say, some struggles, I think, when it comes to sort of securing a move elsewhere, and so maybe that's still playing itself over within the Bournemouth team. In the 7.5 tier, I think Eze is wonderful. I've actually added Gibbs White, and I think I've probably disrespected Gibbs White a little bit. I think you've got a player here who's got set piece share, and maybe if Wood has reduced minutes, he's probably the second penalty taker of the team, which I think is a new thing for him and a bit of a boost. Whether Wood's minutes are less than 90 is probably up for debate. Some people might take offense with what I've said, but I think with Igor Jesus being there, it's unlikely that they're always going to play in a 2, right? So maybe there's going to be games where Igor Jesus comes on as a sub, or you have a little bit depth around, and Wood comes off, and that kind of it improves Gibbs White very, very minorly. But more set piece share is going to be nice for him too, which is something that I do expect with Elanga leaving. It's probably up to him and Anderson to sort of take up the mix, but Gibbs White just generally has some really healthy numbers as well. Also really good for sort of bonus related things because he's kind of like the main progressor of the team. So for things like chance creation and sort of racking up bonus, he's pretty good for that as well. Gakpo I've actually added, and I think he's a top pick. I do think that Gakpo is a bit of a weird one where, Rio is not expected to light the season up, I would say, even though he has the potential for it. But I kind of have just concerns with the amount of depth that they have, even though some players have gone. And clearly that left wing position, it feels like Gakpo pretty much has locked it down. My main concern is, do I think he has better minutes than Wirtz even in the short term? Not necessarily. So I kind of feel like Gakpo is probably a pick that I would let slide, but I wouldn't be surprised if I was completely wrong about this. Any of the players who moved from the forward position into the midfield position, I feel like are generally a little bit underpriced, so their minutes are too good. And I'm referring here to Gakpo and Marmoush. I might just be too low in Gakpo's minutes, but I'm a little bit pessimistic now because I'm not entirely sure what the kind of tactical new ideas that Slot might be bringing to the table with, and what that sort of means for Gakpo. With Gordon, he's going to be sort of an interim penalty taker, but I'm not really sure I really like the value with a Newcastle's fixture. So I'm just going to say that he's still a differential for now. And Newcastle are expected to take in another striker who probably will take penalties away from Gordon. So that's kind of where I'm at with him. In the next tier, we have Wirtz, Bruno, Marmoush. As I mentioned with Marmoush, if he's nailed, I think he's completely broken. But I don't think he's nailed. And that's going to be my starting season expectation with him. I feel like there were plenty of games, especially even within the Club World Cup, where he wasn't always going to start, and he's not a starter. And unless Haaland's injured, which allows for him to be a starter almost permanently, I think that's kind of what hurts Marmoush. Wirtz and Bruno, I think, are fantastic to start the season. I've given Wirtz, I think, a rise. Bruno's really good for DEFCON, so he's just a really well-balanced player. And interestingly, when you kind of look at the underlying stats, I mean, Bruno and Wirtz are very similar. So it's really the DEFCON that kind of separates them. And then obviously the quality of the team, like Liverpool are a better defense. Wirtz might even, for example, tick up on his numbers if he's allowed to play the sort of minutes to sort of match that. But he's, not a penalty taker, for example. So that kind of draws some intangibles away from him. But he's going to be on a lot of set pieces. And I think that's really huge, right? For both Wirtz and Bruno, that has always been a huge positive. With Saka, I think he's a tier below Palmer. I'm happy to be wrong about this. I just think when you look at production, Palmer is still going to be a little bit better. I think that the penalties are a huge kind of aspect as to how we evaluate someone like Saka. And I'd probably back someone like Palmer, who is slightly better NPXG compared to Saka, who's a little bit more tilted towards the assists and much better in terms of sort of getting a lot of that value through those set pieces that Arsenal have. Palmer just generally has better games, and so I'd probably just, if I had to think about the way that a lot of people are drafting, I'd be picking Palmer over Saka for now. And Salah, I don't think there's too much to say about him. I think the projections are still ludicrous for him. The expectations that he's set are still ludicrous, and he's just that good. I think he's better than Haaland, and that is my take for the start of the season. I'd still choose Salah over Haaland, even on a sort of price efficiency type of basis, because at the end of the day, you're really going to be picking one or the other if you're rotating captaincies, and for me, Salah's the one. In the forward position, shifting over to that, I think it's a very, very easy position to cover off. Gu has been added. He's a yellow pick. I think he's just the most obvious 4.5 to pick. I think there's no need to sort of shop for 5.0s for other 5.5s at this point in time because of what Gu provides to us on paper. Do I expect him to start every single match? No. But do you care at the same time? I don't think so. Because as I said, I do feel like the increase in terms of the strength of your weaker players in previous seasons, like a 4.0 defender, or maybe even a baseline of a 4.5 defender has just risen if you've chosen someone who is good at things like CBET or just an extremely attacking player that you can find value from. So I'm very pro just going for Gu at this point in time. But if you want a bench boost and you feel like you want a stronger bench boost, I can understand the value towards a Beto or a Perot, or even someone who's maybe a bit cheaper, like maybe a Mecca who from Leeds who might provisionally start. Do I think that makes too much sense? Not really. I think I wouldn't take the punt because Beto can lose minutes, Leeds can sign another striker, these sorts of things. And do you even want to have a lead striker is another question that probably people should be asking. So yeah, I'm not too sold on needing to spend more money. The Igor Thiago tier I've dropped a little bit, but I think Wisa is actually still very much linked towards leaving. A lot of the reporting, maybe it actually is coming from the Newcastle camp side, so that's probably not indicative of actually Newcastle being able to secure a transfer the other way around. So hey, I've given Igor Thiago a soft drop, and that's because of a little bit of uncertainty still around. But if Wisa leaves, yes, of course, they're going to sign someone else. But his minutes should be very, very safe, and I can't really see that changing. Fulkrug for me is a pick that I've added that I really like. I think Wilson's obviously going to pair well alongside him. I also think he's not going to play full on 90 minutes, so I think that's kind of what's tapering off his value as maybe a green pick. Barry from Everton, I have in the avoid tier, but that's only because I think Beto will start the season and then he'll probably sort of lose his position. that's kind of how I think based on how I rate the players, but I could be completely wrong, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. I just think that right now it's better spot almost to lose, and then Barry has a lot of license and ability and time to be able to take that spot and make it his own. So don't start the season with him, but wait and see. 6.5 tier, I think this is where you start to have some real value in terms of what we call our second or third, like forwards, for example. Strand Larson is absolutely fantastic. I've dropped Welbeck a little bit. I just have some cautions with Welbeck as ever. I think he had a really good season last year. I think he hit his record Premier League tally. He played a lot of minutes actually in the end, despite all the injuries that he always has. He played around 2,100 something minutes. I still have him dropped though. I think the injury sort of sporadically sprinkled in here and there still exists. Hertzler is unfortunately also not a manager who really tends to disclose this sort of information, very much like how an injury will just happen and you'll have to deal with it. And I do think with sort of the depth that they have in terms of the younger players who can sort of fill in other positions, and maybe even like a Jorginho, for example, who I've already mentioned can even deputize as a center forward. I really do think that Welbeck's probably not going to have an insane season in terms of minutes. Is he a really good pick almost from a very narrow perspective? So let's say if you wanted to wildcard early, I think Welbeck makes a lot of sense for that, to be honest. But do I have the confidence that he's going to be a good pick if you kind of want to extend the life of your draft? Not really, unfortunately. Evan Nilsson's the next sort of really robust pick here, where the minutes are safe, the penalty share is there, especially if Kluivert's gone. I mean, it's either him or Semenyo. Interestingly, the only quote that Irola ever gave on penalty taking was after Evan Nilsson missed a penalty versus Chelsea in the first half of last season, and he said that Evan Nilsson and Kluivert are penalty takers. Kluivert then proceeded to score 6 penalties, so you can imagine who actually is the penalty taker. It's obviously Kluivert, but Evan Nilsson is, in a lot of people's minds, the secondary penalty taker. But I think that Semenyo taking and scoring a penalty kick within the Everton match in the FA Cup actually maybe muddies it a little bit, because, you know, Evan Nilsson was 0-1 last season. Semenyo, in an important game, was 1-0. Maybe he's a part of the pecking order, and maybe we're overestimating who's going to take the penalties immediately, because Semenyo is also an extremely key player, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if suddenly Semenyo actually was the one who took penalties if something happens to Kluivert or he's not ready to start the season. In the 7.5 tier, I think Wood is just fantastic. You know, did he overperform? Yes. Does his underlying stats sort of look worse than other people's? Yes, but his minutes were always really good. Do I think his minutes are perfect this season? Not necessarily, but he's always been a really consistent pick. The actual minutes that Wood has is great. The fixtures that Wood has to start the season are amazing. So would you ever feel bad starting this season specifically with Wood? I don't think so. I don't think you can. Solanke has dropped another tier because it doesn't seem like he's ready. He wasn't a part of the squad for the Bayern game. So at this point in time, he's basically close to an avoid for game week 1. I have him as an avoid right now, but that's subject to change. João Pedro, Mateta are interesting picks. Mateta clearly has much worse fixtures, but he is someone who I think is going to have really good minutes because Nketiah is now supposed to be out for 2 months, and that's just going to improve the expected minutes of Mateta, which is huge. And he's already had a good preseason to start with. Not that that means anything, but when you're thinking about, let's say, a pick who's going to have a really good lasting value, then Mateta is clearly one of them because the minutes are there. João Pedro is someone that I still think is a little bit dicey. I think he's quite explosive as a player, but, you know, taking penalties away from him. Was he amazing at sort of grabbing great opportunities as a Brighton player? No, but I really think that, as I mentioned in the previous video, that was a really weird season where I don't think they were quite set in terms of roles, in terms of defining positions, in terms of maximizing performance game to game. Brighton were a very kind of up and down team. I feel like Chelsea are much more consistent. And so I think João Pedro is going to do well for the start of the season, but managing the minutes is going to be a thing. Jackson's most likely leaving, but as I said, managing minutes are a thing. Bowen for me is a fantastic pick. I think he's interestingly one of those picks where if people don't want to spend that much money on Watkins, I think there's absolutely no reason to not just start the season with Bowen, because the value to Bowen and Watkins is exactly the same, right? Other than, you know, maybe Watkins can have penalties as a starting player. But Bowen is someone who just you can't really fail with. I think I initially sort of disregarded Bowen moving towards the center forward position because I thought that, hey, this is a player who is really a midfielder half the time, who doesn't really benefit from this forward change. But when I think a bit more about it, Bowen's always been someone who actually doesn't get bonus anyways, really, as a midfielder who actually gets as many points as he does, because he's a little bit less creative than some of the other mids or isn't involved in a lot of things like set pieces, etc. And so if he's going to benefit more from sort of open play goals, I think that forward change helps. The DEFCON piece, he's actually the only forward I would say who's remotely close to being able to get DEFCON points, so he's one of them. But that doesn't mean much. I would say that he shouldn't really be getting many DEFCON points this season. And he ultimately, under Potter at least, has played a lot of forward. So I kind of think like when I look at the underlying stats here, are they going to be better than the seasonal averages from last season? I think so. And obviously, whenever Paqueta's off the field, he'll be on penalties. I just think that Bowen's a pick who is always reliable for points, is always reliable for goals and assists, and sort of being the true talisman of that team. And the projections that I'm looking at for Bowen actually look really, really healthy. So I think he's good value for that 8 million position. And I can't really see too much of a difference, if I can be honest, on whether you want to go with Watkins if you think that Watkins can maybe have slightly managed minutes, might not be on penalties either. Whereas Bowen kind of gives you just full guarantees of dropping basically 92, 95 minutes a game, and just consistent value for a cheaper price. Ekitike I've actually added. I still think that his minutes will be a little bit worse than maybe the likes of, let's say, a Wirtz, for example. Worse than Wirtz. But I almost have him bucketed similar to Gakpo, where I'm expecting Isak to still move towards Liverpool. Everything is trending towards that direction. I can't really rate Ekitike too highly. Does it seem like he's going to play a bench role if Isak joins? I don't think so necessarily, which is kind of why I think there's got all these knock-on impacts on players like even Gakpo as well. So I kind of have him here because I still think that his minutes are pretty volatile, or at least just not good enough, where his value probably comes from being a consistent starter. Watkins for me is just fantastic. The Gessan news doesn't really hurt him too much. It does hurt the other players, but it also kind of creates some more depth in terms of last season. What did we see that happened at times, right? There was a point in time in the season where Watkins was suddenly sort of second fiddle towards Rashford a little bit. I don't think that's going to really happen at the start of the season, but you still have players like Assad and Malin who can kind of cover center forward minutes. Does that sort of reduce the ceiling of Watkins a little bit? I think it does, because when I looked at the spread season-long projections after the Gessan news was confirmed, Watkins' season-long goals actually dropped a little bit. So it kind of just shows you maybe there's a little bit of pricing in of rotation of reduced minutes, and that does hurt a player a little bit. Gyökeres, I still think he's not going to start the season with perfect minutes. I also think that Arsenal just have some tough games outside of Leeds at home, so I probably am not that excited about him to start. And then, of course, you almost have to make that gamble whether he's a penalty taker or not, which adds a lot more value towards a player playing for this Arsenal team. So I'll have him as a yellow pick. Same with Isak as well, where I think Isak is actually a little bit too overpriced for this season. So it's a tricky thing. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now. And Haaland, I still have him as a green pick, because I feel like even though I am in the pro Salah camp, and I've already shared my thoughts on that, do I think it's extremely bad play to go with Haaland over Salah? No. I still think that there is an opportunity for that. I almost treat it as a 55-45. Like, I think you're kind of taking a bit of a losing play, because it's not just risk you're taking on. It's also, in theory, if we look at projections for the season, you're almost looking at someone who's expected to perform a little bit worse than Salah anyways. And so you're also adding, I guess, what we would say is a negative value play. But maybe the risk is worthwhile to you. And the gamble could still pay off. That's kind of the whole point of a 45-55. In the defense, the cheat sheet, we have Estev being added. The 4.0 option is just absolutely fantastic. You can clearly see that I've completely changed my opinion of the 4.0s, and I have to go back to that sort of hub projection logic where now that the DEFCON points are added in, you can kind of see how obviously clear or good the 4.0 picks are, and Estev is clearly one of them, where a lot of people now are angling this sort of bench boost 2. Is he technically a bench player on bench boost 2? I don't think so. He should be a starter. So when you look at a bench boost 2, you can't put him on the bench. Just going to say that now, but I think he's really good. But Munson/Rodon from Leeds is really good. Reynildo as well. I think you kind of pick and choose the players based on how you want to rotate with your own team. Don't look so much at this tier list as if you have to go with the right 4.0. Choose the player that actually fits your plans. If you're bench boosting on 1, get a Leeds player. If you're bench boosting on 2, get a Stev. If you're bench boosting on 1 anyways and you still like the value of a Stev for whatever reason, maybe because he rotates with some of your other players, get a Stev. In the next 4.5 tier, I think there's just so much value within the game. I almost feel bad making some of these 4.5 picks yellow. I think it could be wrong, but I didn't want to sort of overread. I think Guehi, if he starts for Crystal Palace, is green. I think if he joins Chelsea, is green. I think Richards is going to start. He's going to be green. The only reason why Richards wasn't starting every single game last season is because Chalobah was around. Diouf, I've watched him play a few games now. I think he's a freak. I think he's an insane attacker. The underlying stats that I've seen for Diouf are quite crazy, to be quite honest with you. Does he do any C-bit at all? Absolutely none of it. But he's going to play fullback as opposed to some of the wing positions he's played in the past. And I think that's going to change that. Do you expect C-bits from him? No. But does he have insane attacking value? Yes, much more than Wan-Bissaka to me. And Wan-Bissaka obviously was the best 4.5 without DEFCON points being added last season, but would he have been the best 4.5 with DEFCON points added back? No. So that's kind of a key point to say. I think Diouf kind of takes it on another level because he's that much better as an attacker from what I've seen early doors. Van de Ven, we just saw the Spurs team get absolutely thrashed by Bayern Munich, but am I going to radically change my mind on them? Not really. I actually think Van de Ven's a really good pick. I can see the logic behind people going for Van de Ven as long as he's fit, which obviously is always a big question mark because he has struggled with injury issues, especially with regards to his hamstring. That's going to be a problem, but I think he's going to start the season, and he's a good 4.5 pick. And I think Spurs will at least rack up a lot of these sort of CBIT points. We've seen Porro actually really good at it, and I'll talk about Porro in a moment, but that's kind of my sort of golden list. I think Senesi and Dorgu are really close here, and even Kilman to an extent, but I don't think you can really go wrong with some of the 4.5 yellow picks either. It's really about how you're planning to rotate, how you're planning to sort of manage out the games, and if you have the confidence, right? Dorgu is someone who, when I think about this United team, what is the best starting team? I think it's Dorgu and Ahmad and Dalot on the periphery, but some people might disagree. And at the same time, when you look at the lifeblood of like these Dalot minutes for the last few seasons, like he's going to play a part of this season. And I think that just means there's going to be some lineups where maybe Dalot plays and Dorgu plays alongside, or maybe Dalot plays and Ahmad plays alongside, as we've seen in the preseason. I think we've seen all three variations now, and I think that's going to happen no matter what. So I like Dorgu, but do I think his minutes are perfect? No, and that kind of knocks him off a bit. Kilman and Wan-Bissaka almost hold together because I think the DEFCONs have sort of raised the level of Kilman. Did Wan-Bissaka overperform a little bit last season? Yes. And is he as attacking as Diouf? No. And I think West Ham, unfortunately, are still one of the teams here in this list who are still a really poor defense, unfortunately. Senesi is another really good pick. He is someone actually, interestingly, from this Bournemouth team who always tends to get subbed off a little bit earlier as a center back. So this is even pre-House Houston. That was already happening. So I think that Senesi is going to taper off a little bit based on the CBIT aspect, but is he still going to rack up some really good games, and does he have some of the best CBITs around? Yes, because of the way that he plays and the way that, more importantly, Bournemouth play. Today I think is okay, but I've dropped him a little bit because I think Fulham still has a pretty tough run of games, and honestly, Anderson is the absolute one here. Anderson is, for me, the best defensive pick in the game, and there's not much to be said about that. I think you much rather take the option who has the best amount of CBIT around, and that makes a huge difference. And so that's kind of what I think about Anderson because of how good this Fulham team are defensively. And to be honest, I can still see the idea of, you know, if you're unsure of Teddy's minutes being good enough, I think there's still value towards maybe if you really want like the kind of fullback prototype, just going for Robinson, who does have slightly better underlying stats than Tete. And probably much more guaranteed minutes, although we did see last season there was some shakiness around it, and Robinson might not even start the season. De Kuyper, as I've mentioned in previous videos, doesn't do much CBIT. I don't expect him to do much CBIT, and I think that's a bit of a con. I think that's a con, unfortunately, for Konsa as well. So yeah, that's why we've seen some changes in the cheat sheet and seen much more love for the DEFCONs, and I think that's just because it's changed the game. In the 5 billion tier, I have Williams number 1. I think Robinson actually really close behind. I think Robinson's actually underrated at this point. I'm a bit of a Robinson hater. I'm sure a lot of people know this because I think the overperformance was real. But are the CBITs real? Yes. Is him being a fullback who can get CBIT real? Is he playing for a good team when it comes to the defensive point of view? Yes. All these things apply. Nico Williams just has better games though, so that's kind of why he's top for me. Romero's a new pick. Do you want to spend the 5 million there? Potentially, because he's maybe a bit more robust than Van de Ven. At the same time, I think his sort of historic CBIT numbers are a bit better than Van de Ven's. Let's see how it transforms under Frank, but I think Romero would probably still benefit a little bit more just in terms of how involved he is in those sort of DEFCON actions. Mikolenko and Aina, I really don't like them, and unfortunately I've dropped them. In the 5.5 tier, I actually have Milenkovic rising. I still think the underlying stats in terms of him being an attacker are very consistent. Porro's actually really strong for DEFCON, and you know, when you even compare him against some of his peers here, it's really good. In the preseason matches, he's actually racked up a couple of games now of actually 10 plus points, even versus really tough opposition. So it kind of shows you a little bit how fixture proof he is. If he can be a DEFCON monster in these tougher games, and this was specifically against Arsenal and Bayern Munich. Munoz has also been added, huge omission in the previous cheat. I think Munoz is going to be one of the best picks once again this season. Does he really benefit in this landscape where some of the other players were boosted compared to last season? No. But is he still one of the best picks? Absolutely he is. And it's just a tough start for Crystal Palace, which sort of makes him a yellow pick. Because you kind of want the 5.5 pick, I suppose, to be permanently starting. And then when you have fixtures like Chelsea away and Aston Villa away, you probably would still back the other picks. to start the season. As far as Ruben and Timber, I think they've kind of dropped. As far as like the 6 million players, I've actually given a lot of rises because it seems like Gabriel might be ready to start the season, so there's still an asterisk around him. But I think if he's ready to start the season from game week 1, he is better than Saliba. That's kind of how I would edge it in terms of the green and the yellows. Kukre as well, I think benefits a lot anyways. I don't think the Hato move really changes too much in terms of the needle. Enzo's already talked about how much Hato needs, or, you know, will spend time, I suppose, taking in the integration process of the Premier League. As far as Guardiola, I still think his minutes are really strong. I think City actually have some pretty clean games to start the season compared to, let's say, Liverpool and Arsenal. So on that basis, I think he's going to be really strong. And then Saliba, I think, is just one of the more boring picks, unfortunately, who has been hurt very much by this sort of DEFCON change. Because in a landscape where DEFCON didn't exist, I think the Arsenal players were just really well priced. But now, where you can get value from the 5.5s instead, I don't really like Saliba too much. Iron from Pong, I think, can very much exceed the sort of yellow tier rating that I've given them. But for now, I've kind of been a bit calm with them. I think their minutes can both be really, really strong. And they are the two players in this tier specifically who I think can overperform my expectations very easily. Kirk is a little bit less so because I think he's just less of an attacking player compared to Frimpong. But Frimpong, of course, if you think about it too, was also playing a slightly different role in some of the previous teams he's played for. So when you look at, for example, let's say the Dutch national team, he's pretty much playing in a back 5. When he plays for Leverkusen, I mean, it's even almost more advanced or more pronounced at times as well. So a little bit different to Kirkes, of course, and now they're both moving into a back 4, but I still think Frimpong will just naturally be the more attacking of the two, which is why I like him a bit more. And the reason why Virgil's top is because he is one of the few 6.0s who actually has really good DEFCON. And that's pretty much it for the defenders, which also translates very easily towards the goalkeepers, where Dubravka for me is just the gold standard for the 4 million tier. I think he's just the best by far. There's really no need to even discuss this unless, let's say, Darlow's available and that kind of enables a bench boost 1 for you. At 4.5, I think Areola might actually be moved on, like West Ham seemingly are in the market for another goalkeeper, so I think that kind of hurts Areola. As far as, let's say, Verbruggen, he seemingly is injured, so he might not start game week 1, so that's uncertain. Otherwise, I think he would actually be a green pick. But what I'm saying here is that Areola is either going to be a starting player or the replacement goalkeeper for West Ham is going to start in game week 1 and it probably is going to be a green pick. Whereas with Verbruggen, you're either seeing him as someone who doesn't start game week 1, but then comes into the team in 2 and 3, or maybe a little bit later, but then is a good pick from that point in time. So it's a little bit in terms of the reverse logic there. Clearly, of course, if Areola is starting game week 1, but might be moved off, if we get a little bit more concrete news a week ahead, I'll adjust that sort of tier rating. Kelleher, I think, is good, but I do think Brentford have been a little bit hurt by the kind of like changes towards the save system. I don't think Brentford are as good as people think necessarily compared to, let's say, previous seasons, but I could be wrong about that. I'm keen to kind of look at sort of more goalkeeper projection model data to kind of have a better understanding of things like that. But of course, we're also imputing a huge, I guess, drop off in terms of Brentford. But is it going to be drop off in terms of defense? I don't think so, because I don't think Norgard leaving the team is as transformational as people think. It's more on the attack that I think there's questions about on Brentford, and that's kind of my general take. In the 5 million tier, I think Sanchez is just the king because of the fixtures. Even with Kobel having the ACL injury, I think that Chelsea still are the best defensive team that I'd probably back in this case. Fulham just don't have great fixtures, so Leno's a bit lower in my expectations for now. And then Sells, I think, is arguably really close to Sanchez. I don't have an issue with people starting the season with Sells, but I think if I wanted to go for Nottingham Forest players, I'd clearly just go for the players who actually get DEFCON, as opposed to going for expected clean sheets. As far as the 5.5 tier, I think Raya, Pickford, and Alisson is that sort of order. Part of that's because Pickford actually does saves, which I think is always going to be like a bit of a balance, where even though Everton usually shouldn't be getting, I guess, the same amount of clean sheets as Arsenal, but I think they did last season in terms of Ryan Pickford getting the same amount of clean sheets. The main thing I'd say is that Raya, I would expect to get more clean sheets this season. Pickford probably maybe less or similar, right? Because he's a really good shot stopper at the end of the day. But that's it for the cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.